So I'm going to start talking about Maish. Maish is my father. How did I come to activism? When I was in Yale Law School, we marched against the war. I came home to my family in Queens. I had a huge fight with my father. The book is filled with stories about various fights with my parents. And his words rang through my life from that point on. My father said, "Nance, it's one thing to believe in something. It's quite another thing to do something about it." And those words marked me for life. It's wonderful to be here. The last time I spoke was about, but 7 or 8 years ago. I was a judge then, and as a judge I had to be cautious about what I had to say, although people who heard me then and over the past 17 years wondered in what respect I was cautious about anything. But I can now speak. John's comment, of course, is that now that I can speak, I can't shut up. And there is something to that. But it's wonderful to be here. I'm one of the founders. The Petra Foundation was started in John Shattuck's living room in response to our unimaginable grief at the loss of our friend. And rather than having the traditional memorial, having words at a site or words in a book, we wanted to create a living memorial, a living organization that we would bring together where people like Petra would be honored. And that's what you've seen today. So it's been 24 years. It's wonderful to be here again. I love this organization. I love this woman, Petra Shattuck, whom we commemorate. She was my best friend. Until I had my own family, in truth, I assumed that I would simply be a Shattuck, that I would share the Shattuck family. I would go to their dinners and I would go to their Christmas celebrations. And then I had my own family. I love this foundation. I love the people who come. And best of all, I love the awardees. It is really a unique foundation. Nowhere is it more clear than in the recent election. There would be times I would come to a Petra dinner and listen to the awardees and say to myself how much I wished that the judges that I worked beside could come here and hear these stories. That when you're in front of a courtroom and you see people in front of you, you don't exactly understand what you have done to them. And you don't understand what their lives are like. And if you spend the next 20 years living with judges, as we do, until I left, you never understand that. And you begin to talk to each other. And nowhere is it more clear than in the recent election. There had been so much debate. It was just pompous from one end to the other. There was debate about real issues, about the economy, about women's rights, about foreign policy, and then idiocy about, whose dog was on top of whose car. But there was a single glaring omission, which is what we talk about here and they were not talking about. And it was about the criminal justice system. It was extraordinary. There was no talk about what one scholar has described as America's failed experiment in mass incarceration. America's failed experiment in mass incarceration. The fellows here talk about that. And every Saturday morning, they're the people who work with prisoners and work with prison conditions, and people who deal with innocence projects, juvenile justice, capital cases, Shakespeare within the walls of a prison, activists against racism in the criminal justice system, families and friends of incarcerated children. Paul Ryder writes about prison news. Then there are the people who deal with prisoners when they get out of prison, re-entry. What to do with people whose lives were dysfunctional before they began, and after 20 years in prison, we wonder why they cannot start again. And then we deal with people who before they went to prison, whose lives were a mess before they went to prison, whose lives were disaster waiting to happen. So we're all in the Petra Foundation dealing with the criminal justice system in one way or another, but we don't hear about this outside the walls of this organization. I don't want to talk at you. I was sitting there thinking about, following Dick Balzer is already a problem. I don't want to talk at you. I don't want to deal with statistics. So I want to tell a story. Damian Perry was a defendant, an African-American defendant in my courtroom. He was one of 21 men in an indictment against the Castlegate gang. I didn't know from the Castlegate gang, but it sounded ominous. There were three kinds of defendants in this case. There were those who were accused of violence. Then there were those who were going to cooperate with the government, who were accused of doing bad things but were going to cooperate with the government. And finally, there were people at the bottom, like Damian, who was only 20 years old, who were accused of dealing crack. He gets swept into this because the government wanted him to be a cooperator. It was going to squeeze everyone to get at the people on the top. But some people wouldn't be squeezed. The cooperators were interesting. These were people who yesterday were dealing crack on the streets of Boston and today made another business decision. And the business decision, of course, was to cooperate with the government. There was no sense that they had changed. But in fact, the system was going to be more lenient with them, the system that I was supposed to be a part of. And this notion that this was a gang, Castlegate gang, I never trusted what I heard, and so I asked to investigate what this gang was. Castlegate was a group of kids who grew up on a block together. There was no initiation, there were no colors, there was no right, there was no organization. You just hung out together. It sounded very much like the Lower East Side that my father had grown up on, where the Irish were on one block, the Italians were on one block, the Jews were on one block. If you crossed over, you'd be beaten up. This was much more serious. These were battles with guns. But there was no content to the organization as we understood a gang to be. And Damian just felt like cannon fodder. The government would go after him not because he was one of the bad guys, but in order to get one of the bad guys. I tried to know the people in front of me as best I could. I'm in a robe on a bench, and they are words on a page, but I tried to find out as much as I could. When Damian appeared before me, I sensed something different. He was a stocky man with a left eye swollen from a shooting accident that left him partially blind. The pre-sentence report told a not unfamiliar story. His mother was 17 when he was born. She turned to drug abuse shortly thereafter and prostitution. His father was 15, too young to care for him. He was raised by his maternal grandmother. She was wonderful, but she could not deal with the street. He had a great memory. He did well in school. Then a minor encounter with the police, and that's often how it happened. Trespassing and disorderly conduct at 15. Gets swept into the criminal justice system for doing, candidly, things that my kids did and walked away. He gets swept up into the criminal justice system. And then at 16, he and a friend were playing with a shotgun when it accidentally goes off. He's shot in the head and loses his left eye. Doctors could not remove pieces of the shot because they were too close to major arteries, and fragments remained in his brain, causing him to have headaches so powerful that he could not speak. He dropped out of school. Imagine how difficult that is for someone in a supportive community to deal with. His maternal grandmother could not deal with him. He drops out of school. He becomes part of Castlegate, which was the only community he knew. I did what I could. The government asked for 12 years for dealing crack on a corner with a minor record. I did what I could. I gave him the mandatory minimum. I could not go any lower. 5 years was the minimum. There are judges who'll be sentencing individuals who say, there's nothing I could do. There was never nothing you could do. In 17 years, there was never nothing you could do. Even if all I could do was to sentence Damian and say, There's no judging going on in this case. You were sentenced by the government to the 5-year mandatory minimum. I would not have given you that amount, and everyone in this courtroom knows what a tragedy it is, but I will sentence you to that 5 years. He gets out. And he was supposed to go and report to probation. I had actually seen him when he was in jail. From time to time, I visited prisons. Judge visiting prison is ridiculous, but you know, the place is so clean. It reeks of Clorox. You're afraid to go to the bathroom, not because it isn't clean, but you don't want to mess it up. You know you're seeing a different world. I ran into Damien while he was in prison, and he would come up to me, and if my name had been in the paper, he would bring me the articles. So when he got out of jail, he was supposed to report to probation, and instead of reporting to probation, Damien reported to me. I was in court in some ponderous corporate case, and all of a sudden in the corner I see him coming forward. And he was smiling, and I take a recess and I invite him into my lobby, and he and I began to talk about what his hopes and dreams would be. And from time to time when he was out on supervised release, he would come back and report to me, and it was a struggle. We would have the following conversations. I have a girlfriend now. That is wonderful, Damien. What's she like? Well, she has a job. Gee, that's really terrific. What is she doing? Oh, Judge, she's an exotic dancer. The Jewish mother in me, I didn't know what to say. You couldn't do better, Damien. Perhaps I can suggest someone. But I had these boundaries. I had to be careful. He was in and out of trouble still. I did what I could to keep him from going back to prison. It's another revolving door. We wonder why people can't get a job, right, after they come out of prison, and so when they don't get a job, we wag our fingers and we send them back. I did what I could to keep him out. He finally reunites with his father. He's working in his father's trash business. His girlfriend, new girlfriend, a little bit better. And he seemed to be finally escaping where he started. One Saturday, I get a call from the U.S. Attorney, Assistant U.S. Attorney on the case. An unusual call in the middle of the weekend. He wanted to let me know something. Sure, I worked all the time. It didn't seem unusual. Damien, he said, was gunned down on the streets of Roxbury the previous day. It seems that it was a gang hit. Was he in a gang? Still? U.S. Attorney didn't know, I didn't know. Was it just that nothing he could do could escape the label? He was still associated? I didn't know, they didn't know. I called the Boston Globe. Judges are not supposed to call the press. I called the press all the time. I called the Boston Globe because I didn't want the headline, I didn't want it to be on page 40 of the Globe, you know, gang member shot on the street. I wanted them to understand something about a human being whom I had come to know. And I told them about the human being I had come to know. And true to form, the Globe writes an article not about Damien, but about us. And the article was, "Shooting Death Shatters a Rare Bond. Judge mourns ex-gang member." They couldn't write about him without writing about me. I was the only way to legitimize his death somehow. They couldn't write about a human being. They had to write about me. I was disappointed in the article, and then I got a phone call. I got a phone call from Damien's father, who wanted me to speak at his ceremony, at his funeral. Because as it turns out, every time Damien did something wrong, he'd tell his father, "Judge Gertner will be disappointed in me." Every time he did something good, he would write it down so that he could tell me about it. And his father wanted me to report that story to people. So I went to the funeral. Ambivalent on the one hand because I knew him less than many of the people in the room. And I told the story that I'm telling you now about a life that was tragically ended and that could have had real promise. And that the real promise and the real disappointment was not so much in him. If he were in front of me, I'd say, Judge Gertner wasn't disappointed in you. I was disappointed in the schools and the prisons and the probation and the society that never gave you a chance. 21 kids in Castlegate I sentenced. I checked. 17 years I was on the bench, and I've tracked them all. I actually kept track of everyone I sentenced. Not a single one of them has succeeded. Not a single one of them has succeeded. So that leaves me to the broader issues, to the broader concerns. How can it possibly be in this society after this election that we don't talk about mass incarceration? We have more people in our prisons than any other country in the world, followed by Rwanda, the Russian Federation, and Iran. We have more people in our prisons than anyone in Europe, than our nearest peers, nearly 7 times as much. We have a rate of incarceration that has just increased exponentially since the 1990s. And of the people in our prisons, 60% are racial or ethnic minorities. In fact, let's make this even more clear. It's not just the failed experiment in mass incarceration. It is, as one person described, the greatest incarceration of African Americans since Reconstruction. For black men in their 30s, 1 in 10 men are in prison on any given day. 1 in 9 African American men aged 20 to 34 are behind bars. 1 in 4 African American young men before the age of 24 will be under the supervision of the criminal justice system. It is a tragedy, and it is more the tragedy that it's not something we talk about. Is this associated with the crime rate? I gave a talk in Hawaii over the summer to other judges, and I knew that in the audience someone would say, well, we had to do this because of crime. Baloney. Or as, who is it? Biden said, malarkey. Or better yet, leave it at that. The crime rate has nothing to do with this imprisonment rate. The crime rate has been declining since the 1990s. Our crime rate now is virtually where it was 30 years ago. The imprison rate is completely a function of politics and inattention. It is completely a function of politics, and it's completely a function of suddenly crime became the 24/7 news coverage subject years ago. The growth in and it's not that we're doing anything even about the crime that we had. John and I went on a tour of some of the neighborhoods in Boston, and there was a young woman who said to us, "What are you people doing?" She said, I loved it when people addressed me like that. "What are you people doing? You are taking off the street the people from 20 to 24, being replaced by the 16 and 15-year-olds who have absolutely no values. We had some kind of code of the street, and all you've done is replace them with even younger, more wandering, more lawless kids. In fact, the notion that we're doing anything about the drug war when we replace one drug dealer with another is ridiculous. All we have done is taken one person off the street, but the drug dealing, the drug culture is such that it's only a question of time before someone takes their place. This is not like an ordinary business that we've somehow undermined. In fact, the street corner is covered within minutes. It would be one thing if we would say, as some of the audiences that I've spoken to have said, well, we're incapacitating people. Who cares? We're keeping them off the street during their crime-prone years. Who cares? It is not without consequences. Bruce Western, who's a sociologist at Harvard, says, this is an inequality created by incarceration that is invisible, cumulative, and saddest of all, intergenerational. It is invisible in the way our political campaign just suggested, because it is segregated. You don't feel it in this room except for our fellows who would feel it. You don't see it unless you're at Rikers, as I was actually a few weeks ago. You don't know about it unless you're working with people in prisons. So the people in this room and the people who are watching television during the campaign somehow miss it. It is cumulative. It cumulatively diminishes the status of the people who come out of prison whose employment prospects are already quite low. And worse yet, it's intergenerational. There is a correlation between one generation's crime and whether or not they had incarcerated parents. It is intergenerational. It contributes to domestic violence. We are changing the male-female ratio in some of these communities, which it changes the way men and women relate to one another. It has destroyed communities. It is not without consequences. And there are the collateral consequences, which you actually will have seen during this election. 5.85 million felons, of large percentage African Americans, were disenfranchised in this election as a result of laws in some jurisdictions that date from Reconstruction. Can't vote, can't serve on juries, can't get college loans from the government, can't get public housing, will be deported, can't get benefits from the government, and we wonder why Damian Perry couldn't find his way after he was released. Michelle Alexander put it best. Today, in communities of color across America, large majorities of African American men have been branded criminals, felons for life, and as a result, many are denied the right to vote, automatically excluded from juries, legally discriminated against in employment, housing, access to public education, all public benefits. Many of the forms of discrimination we thought we left behind in the Jim Crow era are legal again, once you've been branded a criminal. So we're a small organization. We have 90 fellows, a core of people in this room, board members and friends. We have this event to speak to each other and steel us for when we walk out the door, strengthen our backbone, nurture our souls. I can speak now as a judge, and I feel desperately guilty every time I think about Damian Perry and the people I could have helped if I had remained on the bench. And the trade I made for myself was that I would trade in those robes for the ability to speak and speak all the time. I'm reminded of words from two important people. Rabbi Heschel, who said, "The opposite of good is not evil. The opposite of good is indifference." And Reverend King, "To accept passively an unjust system is to cooperate with that system. Not to act communicates to the oppressor that his actions are right." Social activism is required for living in this community. Now that I can speak, I will. And with any luck, if this organization continues and people like those in this room continue, our voices will be heard. Thank you.